Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you for inviting me. It's very, very nice to be here. Before I start, you might have noticed if you're on social media, particularly if you're on Twitter, there's this meme going around informing us that it's the last month of this decade and to think back on what we've done. And it occurred to me that one of the things that I've done in the last decade is to adopt a much more, maybe not as transparent as I would like it to be, but an extremely transparent workflow. And that's something I think of all the things that I've done in the last decade, one of the things that I'm most pleased that I've done and proud of. And so I'll tell you a bit about why I did that and what I think it's done, why I think it's helped me, and why I think thinking about adopting a similar workflow or one that is suited to your particular research needs is something you will not regret either. So these are selfish reasons to adopt transparent research practices. So many of you are here today because you're wondering, should I adopt open research practices? We all, most scientists, I assume everyone in here probably as well, endorses openness. So this is a tenet of the scientific method, is that we're showing people what we've learned. We're not just telling them that we've learned it. It should be possible to check a scientist's work, to verify their analyses, to know that they've done what they've said they've done. So we endorse openness, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we prioritize it. It's perceived to be a lot of work, and sometimes perceived to be extra work on top of what you would do anyway. And in exchange for this extra work, besides the good feeling that your work is consistent with your ideals, your rewards are a bit fuzzy. Is it idealistic only? Is it only for this warm feeling that you're behaving in a consistent way? If so, maybe this is important to do at some point. Maybe this is something that I endorse doing generally and I'll encourage other people to do. But maybe it's not vital for me. Maybe now, at this moment, I have too many strategic concerns. I have work that I need to get done very quickly. I can't change up how I'm doing it because that will slow me down. Various other strategic concerns that prevent me from adopting openness. These strategic concerns are what we hear often, especially from junior researchers, who think that they might be disadvantaged if they prioritize these kinds of practices over the work that they do in general. We hear things like, won't it slow me down? If I'm going to adopt all of these new practices, often it involves learning some new skills. That takes time, and that means I won't be able to write papers quickly. And if I can't write papers quickly, then am I able to find my next position? Am I able to convince someone to give me the permanent job that I want at some point? Going on to that, is it strategically good for me to give away the work I've done to someone else who then might go and use it for something I might have used it for? Why should I share it with someone else who then might benefit from it in a way that I didn't benefit from it? You hear this often with sharing code and materials, like, I worked for months to get this program working. Why should I just give it to someone else and let them jumpstart their research on the back of it? Or why should I let someone see my data set when they might publish an analysis from it that I didn't do yet? Finally, I think the most compelling one is what if I'm seen to fail? What if I publish my code and someone shows that it doesn't work like I thought it worked? What if I publish the steps that went into my analysis and someone else does it and shows I made a mistake? It's funny every time. What if they see that I've made a mistake? If that happens, maybe they'll never trust me again. Maybe they'll think that all of my work is like this. Better that they just don't see it at all. So these are real concerns. I'm not going to try to say that you shouldn't feel these things or that it isn't anxiety-provoking to feel them. It certainly is. But I'd also like to argue that each one of these concerns has a flip side of potential benefit that you might also want to think about bravely going after. So, is this going to slow me down? Possibly, but slower often correlates with better. It's not necessarily a strategic good to be jumping into the next research project, collecting data before you've thoroughly thought through what it is you'd like to do, quickly getting some program up and ready to go before it's been thoroughly checked out. In the end, that might actually waste you time because it might mean that you end up doing work that you're not happy with and not really excited to be promoting to publish anyway. So slower might correlate with better. Sharing your materials with other people might mean that they're able to do similar work faster than you were able to do it, but it also marks you as a good collaborator. I couldn't begin to say how many times someone else has taken someone's data and done something with it without attributing the original source or used someone's code in a similar way. But I can think of loads of examples where people have taken the materials of others, used them, cited the original author profusely, thanked them quite a lot, made their name prominent because they shared this information. I can think of many instances where sharing has jump-started collaborations and got the original share onto grant opportunities that they hadn't been associated with before, or even authorship that they hadn't necessarily associated with. And so it isn't necessarily the case that sharing your materials will give someone the jump on you. It might end up being an opportunity for you as well. And finally, what if you fail? What if you're seen to fail? Well, catching mistakes and correcting them, if it's done in public, that's very painful, sure. But surely that's better than an unnoticed error persisting in the literature, possibly causing an inability of other groups to replicate work, misleading other scientists into thinking something that they believe to be true is true, and causing them to chase that when in fact there's a mistake that's driving this main finding. As painful as it would be to be caught out publicly in an error like that matters for the take-home point of your paper, surely that's better than just letting it persist. And often the processes and workflows that you can adopt in order to get ready to share your materials and your data with other people are instrumental in preventing these mistakes in the first place, making sure that you're the one or your lab catches the mistake itself and you're not dependent on someone else to do that for you. So I think there's a lot of benefits to adopting transparent research. I think choosing transparency could actually be considered a good career strategy, not just something that you're doing for idealistic reasons because you think it's right. So why do I think that openness is a good strategy? Well, here I'm speaking mainly to early career researchers. So PhD students who are looking ahead to your postdoc position or the fellowships that you want to write to become a postdoc. Postdoctoral researchers who are looking ahead to when you will get to start a research group on your own, so that achieving that kind of position. Once you get into this kind of position where you have a bit more autonomy, you may not have, well, first of all, in the coming years, you might not have much choice about whether to adopt open research practices because more and more journals and funders are mandating that you must share data associated with a paper or with a grant, or you must make materials publicly available. So you might not have a choice about it, and it's easier to do it preemptively than after the fact. Speaking to people who are thinking about managing other researchers in the near future, maybe we could all agree that transparency within our own lab group is essential. I mean, of course, you have to be able to see the data that your students and research assistants produce for your group. Yes, I mean, they can't hide it from you. That's not allowed. Of course, you have to be able to inspect the analyses that they do. Of course, you have to be able to understand what it is they've done in the lab to generate the data that you're going to be writing about. So we can all agree that that's the case. And so I wonder, do we necessarily have that? Does the lab that you work in have a workflow that makes it easy for lab members to see what other lab members are doing? to reproduce analyses, to know where data are stored and be able to do independent things with them, to understand what happened in the lab to produce those data. I would argue most of the labs that I know, maybe a little, maybe not so much. A lot of this depends on how active the principal investigator is, or the people who are managing other people are, in setting up systems that make it easy for lab members to look into each other's work and to use each other's materials. So that's an area I think where a lot of labs could use some improvement, sort of in-lab transparency. What are the things that we would need in order to achieve transparency among our own colleagues? The main thing that I think is important to realize is that the same things that would allow you and your close colleagues to really understand what it is you've done and what you're working on into work are the same things that would give confidence about exposing these processes outside of your lab. And so if you've got a system within your lab that allows this to happen, then you'll start to feel much, much better about showing your work to other people. So what we need to improve our own in-lab workflow also increases confidence about sharing more broadly and makes the process of doing it simpler and less work. So what I'm really talking about here, unfortunately, and I'm sorry if this is news to anyone, is it's not good news, or at least it wasn't to me, is that when you start to manage to be the principal investigator of a lab group, what you're doing is transitioning from being a researcher to being a manager. I know that's not what I signed up for either. As a PhD or a postdoc, you mainly manage yourself, and your worth is you're judged on your own research skills, and so you have a lot of control over that. Like you can do your research to whatever standard of rigor you think is important. The research is always quite close to you, and so you know what you're doing, and you know whether you're happy with it, and you can change that up yourself. You're responsible for it, and you're judged on that. It's very clear. When you're a principal investigator, this is not that true anymore because you're not often the one doing the research. You're not often the one in the laboratory. Sometimes you're not the one primarily doing the analyses. You're judged on how well the people who are working with you do those things. And so if up until this point you have prided yourself on being a good researcher, what's now your job is to translate the things that you think made you a good researcher to your trainees. That's your primary responsibility. And that's what you're judged on, because all of your papers that you can write, all of the grant applications that you can write are fed by this research that's done by your trainees. You may, I hope not for your sake, but I did, and I think most people do, face limited resources when you start out. So when I started out as a principal investigator, I'd come off of 1 year of being a postdoc and several years of being a PhD student in a very productive lab. Both of the labs that I worked in prior to founding my own were extremely well funded. They had a lot of resources dedicated to them, permanent personnel, more or less permanent personnel that knew the systems and could help train new researchers coming in. That's not how people start out in general. When I started out, I shared a lab with 5 other staff members and all of their students. That lab had space for testing 3 participants in it. That's a lot to manage between a group of like 15 to 20 people. You have limited funding. You probably might not have it right away. You probably can't hire people to do things. You're going to have personnel that are coming to you through your university, working on projects with you for educational credits and things like this. And so these are short-term personnel. They turn over quite quickly. They might be working with you for a few months or maybe a year, and then they'll be replaced by someone else. What this means for your process of collecting data, analyzing it, writing papers about it, is that it could take quite a while to build up a sort of chain of evidence that you feel comfortable writing a paper about. And so since that's happening across time, with many people contributing to the process, you are ultimately the one that has to know what they did month after month, year after year for the 6 months, 3 years, I don't know how long, it depends on your work, that it would take to go from starting the project to being able to write about it. And that is a challenge. You are the one that's bridging these limits. And so you need to know what your team is doing, and they need to know what you think, because you're training them, and you're training them by instilling the things that made you a good researcher into. So, principal investigators, I'm going to argue, need in-lab transparency. They need it to ensure consistency in training researchers, especially when there's going to be a lot of turnover of researchers. They need it to know the provenance and protect the security of their data so that they don't lose data, and so they always know where their data came from. They need to stem information loss that comes when people leave the lab, because that will happen frequently when you don't have a lot of money to sustain personnel. And to make it easier in the end to share publicly when the time is right. And every year, it's more and more likely you're going to be asked to do that. All right, I want to show you a concrete example of what I mean about building up papers from the work of short-term personnel. So in this particular paper that my student Monica and I wrote, we published this paper in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition in 2016. And the one experiment from the paper, the main meat of the paper, came from the master's dissertation of my student Monica Marone, who graduated in 2014. So I mean, actually, this delay is not too bad. Finishing your master's thesis in 2014 and having a paper published about it less than 2 years later. Not bad at all, like actually in print. Of course, it was accepted much sooner than that. But that's not anywhere near the whole story here. In order for Monica to be able to do the excellent project that she did, she would have needed to build it upon something. It's unlikely that someone doing a project for just a few months is going to hit on something that's publishable immediately. And she did have things to build on. In fact, she had pilot data from two of my students working with me at University Groningen a couple of years earlier that she was able to use to develop her hypotheses. She had the experimental program that we used back in Groningen to collect those data, to modify, to do what she wanted it to do. And then there were some inconclusive results from her experiment for her thesis. And so 2 more students at the University of Edinburgh, where I was by then, Tulia and Josephine, who wanted to gain research experience for a few months working in a laboratory, came along and helped me adapt Monica's experiment into a follow-up experiment that would address the gaps that hers had left and collect those data so that we could present a multi-experiment arc to a journal editor. So although each student thinks that their project is theirs and it's a discrete part of their education and training, and they might think that it would be great if we could publish it, actually it's part of something bigger, and the chances that we would be able to publish it are pretty slim unless it is part of this bigger constellation of work. And as a principal investigator, that's your role, to know where you can fit your trainees' work together to make something bigger out of it so that you can promote the good work that they've done and get it more widely known. So it took many, many years for me to figure out how to do this. We're not trained as PhD students, at least I wasn't, not as a postdoc either, how to manage things. We're taught how to do good research. We're not taught how to manage other people and to get other people to do good research with us. And so it took many years to figure out what would be a good way to do this, like how I could communicate things that I think are important to my trainees in a way that would help them do that work, not hinder them or keep them from being creative. And these are the things that I've hit on as working really well for me, and I'm going to explain them to you. Maybe some of them will work well for you too. First is a lab handbook. Second, the Open Science Framework, which of course I don't take responsibility for. I'm very happy that the Center for Open Science has made this great resource available to us, but I think it's absolutely brilliant to use for organizing your work. Adopting scripted analyses and pre-registration. So I'll go through these each one. All right, so my lab handbook, what's the point of this? Sometimes I actually show this, but I'm worried about running out of time. So I'll just tell you a bit about it. It's written in Bookdown, hosted on GitHub. And I've done this because that makes it very easy to update. So the sort of information that I have in here, some of it lasts quite a long time. So it has practical and conceptual information. And a lot of that practical information is more or less permanent. It includes things like the location of rooms where you might be testing participants and how it is you would access them, how it is you would gain access to research participants at the university in which I work, what resources are available to help you learn to program something or to do an analysis. So some of that stuff changes very little year on year. Others of it changes on a monthly basis. So for instance, other information in this manual include where lab meetings are and what we're going to talk about. So that gets updated fairly frequently. Personnel get updated fairly frequently because I have some research assistants who are more stable and many students who come and go after a few months. And so if I had a PDF document or a Word document that I just sort of emailed around to everyone, there would always be old ones in circulation. I could update it all I want, but if people find the old one, then that's what the information they're going to have. Having it online means that when I update it, that's the version. The old versions are always overwritten. And so whenever someone wants to have a look at it, it's always the latest version that I've published. It's also very handy to view and navigate in web browsers instead of with a more static document. So there's links in it that take you from one section to another as needed. For instance, if you need to know, I believe anyway, if you need to know how to submit an ethics application, I can put in live links to where you would go to find that at my university. So again, why do this? Why have a lab handbook? One reason is to make it clear to new personnel in advance what they can expect. And I've found that this is really, really useful for the most short-term personnel in the lab. Research assistants who are coming on for just a part of a year, and students who are coming on for a discrete project. They don't have much time working with you, and they genuinely seem to want to make the most of it. They want to do the best that they can. But oftentimes, especially with undergraduate students, they've not done this sort of work before, and they don't know what to expect. And so it can really give them a boost, knowing more what to expect, realizing that they don't know what you know, and having a set of milestones that they need to achieve, information all in one place about where to go when they have a particular problem or want to learn something in particular. It's really useful. It also keeps them from always coming to you with these questions, because you'll find it's very, very difficult to remember who you've told what. Again, it sets milestones. So part of the conceptual things that I've chosen to put in my manual are things about what completed work is. So when is a job finished, and what concrete things are associated with a job being finished. So I can say a bit more about that when I talk about how I use Open Science Framework. But this is what when we're finished with something to the point that we're ready to share it with someone else, we're putting it on Open Science Framework. It's to some stage of completion. It explains workflows that new personnel can exploit. So it explains, for instance, what it is we want to do when we've decided that we've got enough data on a particular protocol. At that point in time, a lot really needs to happen. At that point in time, we need to do something beyond what we've normally done to back up the data and make sure it's secure. We need to go through the demographics of the participants that we've got and make sure that there's no reason to exclude any of them based on our eligibility criteria. Nothing slipped through the cracks in this respect. We need to have at least a preliminary look at the data to see if all of the participants passed various manipulation checks that we included. And we need to document that in a way so that if one of us then picks up these data in 6 months or in a year trying to write about them, it's clear to see why we made the decisions we made about what stays and what goes. Now, you might think, is this too prescriptive? Isn't part of learning to do research coming up with these kinds of things yourself? Maybe so. But again, we don't know how much or what a new lab member knows when they come in. We don't know how they have chosen to work or were directed to work previously. And so we don't know if what they're going to do is extremely effective or whether it will clash with something that other members of the lab do. And so allowing people to sort of sort this out for themselves could end up preventing problems that aren't really that useful to learn from. This is down to theory of mind. So theory of mind is realizing that I don't realize what you don't know. And I think it's better to be upfront about that, to say right up front, yep, I don't know what you don't know, and so I'm going to tell you what I think is important explicitly. Importantly, it is an evolving document. I've set it up the way I have so that it's very easy to change. And so lab members themselves can propose changes to it. If someone comes in that has been working on something in a way that is really, really good, and he or she explains it to the group and we really like it, that would be a reason for updating the workflow that we've got coded down and changing the way we do things. They've got a better script for handling some analysis, or we do something in a clumsy way and they can make it better, then we don't have to prescribe, nope, we're going to do it the way we do it. We can adopt that into our own routine and make ours better. All right. So the second thing that I started using with my researchers is the Open Science Framework. How many people are familiar with Open Science Framework who's used it themselves? Oh, so pretty much everybody. So I'm really preaching to the choir here. So very briefly then, it's a tool you can use to organize, backup, and eventually share finished components. But some nice features about this are that it doesn't necessarily have to be public, at least not for a very long time. OSF is free to use, and it's a private to public sharing model. So regardless of whether you are committed to eventually opening up your resources to other people beyond your lab, you can use it privately amongst your own collaborators in order to conveniently share and also back up work. So it's creating an additional backup for you as well. It's a really good tool for supervision, I find, because you can see very quickly where a project stands. If you've got trainees who are curating their work on Open Science Framework, at least while they're working on it for you, privately, not publicly, then you can, when you log in yourself and you've got a list of your projects, you can see, all right, my project with so-and-so, where does it stand? You can have a look and see, have they got this done? Have they got this done? What's there? It quickly lets you see how far along they are, what they might need help with next, what they might need a bit of a push on. I find it really nice for this. If you are planning to share your work publicly, then you can get a digital object identifier assigned to the project, which is extremely useful, especially if one of the things you're sharing is explicit materials that might not be discussed in depth in the paper that you publish about them. So someone using an experimental program that you use might be in a position to cite your Open Science Framework page earlier than any paper you've written about that program, or you might not have said what they really want to cite for in the paper that's associated with that material. Having the digital object identifier on your Open Science Framework page then means that they've got something that they can cite if it doesn't seem appropriate to cite your academic story about that material. So it means that it's more likely you're going to get credit for your work. So one thing that I'm leading to here with using Open Science Framework as a tool for monitoring the projects that are going on in your lab is that you're having your trainees share things with you as a sort of preemptive curating the data, where if you would decide later, sort of preemptive curating the data, where if you would decide later that you're going to share it publicly, you've already got everything in order. This is a really good idea. So organizing materials as you go is quite easy. And really, it's something that we do in our own individual minds and individual research silos anyway. The difference between doing that and working with your colleagues on something like OSF is that you have some negotiation about how you're going to present things or how you're going to organize them. That itself doesn't take a tremendous amount of time, I don't think. So you're just doing something you would ordinarily do. Organizing materials years after you finish a project is entirely another story. That's really difficult. And what makes it difficult isn't the organization process itself. It's that you have to make whatever organization you're imposing on it at time n plus 1, let's say, the year after you've published it. You're imposing whatever you have to compare what you're choosing to do with it at future time with what you actually did with it at the time you last stopped working on it. And one at that point is then to kind of see if you can reproduce what you've done yourself, which can be challenging if you haven't put together an organization scheme that makes that easy, right? So this happened to me at one point in the last decade as I was developing these systems. I received, more than once received an email from someone out of the blue asking for some data from an article that I published. And I've never had a problem sharing these things with people, but at this point, I see the subject line of the email, and I had started organizing things on OSF. I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. They just didn't Google for my OSF page. But in fact, the data that they wanted were something like 10 years old. And these data were actually from the very first project I did when I started the lab that I worked in as a PhD student. In the US, you start off with a master's degree in the same lab and then work up from there. So this was the data from the paper that came out of my very first project, my master's thesis. So I thought, well, this is going to be interesting. This is going to be like doing a bit of time travel to see, one, can I find this data that I collected at that point, something like 13 years ago? Will I be able to find it at all? Will I be able to figure out what's in it? Will I be able to reproduce the analysis that we did? Because I would feel much more comfortable sending it to someone else if I can verify that actually the data I'm sending are the ones that match what's in the paper and we didn't make an error in writing up that paper that was somehow never caught. So when this happened, I spent a morning working it out, like 4 solid hours, searching for where these data were, figuring out that they matched and reproducing an analysis. So I've learned a few things from this process. One was that I gave myself an A+ for hierarchization of information on my own computer because I didn't find any problem with like finding the folder where this project was, and within that folder things were organized in a reasonable way so I could tell where the data were and I could tell where they came from and things. What I couldn't tell from this process was what experiment corresponded to which one in the paper very easily. So we had, and I'd totally forgotten, run more experiments than we published, for instance. And so experiment 1 in my folder hierarchy was not experiment 1 in this paper. So I had a false start of getting some data out and then, these don't look like they're actually, but it turns out that wasn't the experiment that was in the paper anyway. And ultimately, I was able to reproduce this analysis and move on. But what's frustrating about work like that, so it's just a few hours. I was able to send this on. I put it on Open Science Framework, so no harm done. But I already did that work 10 to 13 years ago. And so anything that I'm doing with it now is just extra. And if I had organized it in a way that made it easier to just click send when this request came in, then I wouldn't have had to spend 5 minutes on it. If I had organized it in a way where I had actually put it on the internet when it was published, then I would never even have received the email. The person would have just found it and done whatever it is they were going to do with it. So preemptive transparency would have been very helpful, and I think is very helpful now that I do it all the time. Finally, we're not only teaching trainees to do research, we're teaching them all sorts of communication. And I think this kind of organization is a form of communication. It's a skill that trainees should learn. So making it part of the workflow that leading a paper, instead of what happens after writing a paper at a point when the data are requested, means it's more likely that the trainee is going to do it and not someone who's more permanent in the lab who ends up getting that request some years later after the trainee responsible has moved on to something else. Front-loading this work means that the person who is responsible for it actually does the work. So, in summary, when you've curated the project, just briefly, because I don't want to go into exactly how these analyses work, I chose to adopt scripted analysis techniques rather than the sort of point-and-click based things that I had been trained to use as a student. The advantage of scripted analyses is that they're more easily reproducible. And reproducible analyses are essential for knowing what it is you're publishing. If you've got people working with you for fairly short periods, and they're gradually building up projects that you put together, you again are the one bridging these projects. You're the one who ends up combining them into a paper. Your name is on that paper, and you need to know that those analyses, that they're correct. You need to be able to reproduce them. With scripting, that becomes very easy. Without scripting, you make one different choice in the hierarchy of point-and-click menus, and all of a sudden you haven't replicated the analysis and you're not sure why. So your trainees might be responsible for an analysis at some point. It's part of their pedagogy and part of the project that they're doing. But they might not be around to verify this after you receive a revision request at some later time point. You might be the one that has to do it. And so making sure that you've got a workflow that makes it easy to verify what they've done at every step means that when this time comes, some years possibly from when that student is finished with their analysis, that you don't have to pick up and redo a lot of work, just to check that they did it right, which they very likely did. So scripted analyses also make checking work easier so that you can be more certain that analysis and write-up are consistent. And so that as the work is going on, you can be certain, you can quickly check if there's some misunderstanding about how to carry out this analysis in the first place. It doesn't go on for too long because it's not hidden behind menu-driven programs. And finally, the last thing that I've adopted that I want to encourage you to consider is pre-registration. Pre-registration, you will have learned in some workshops, I think, in the last couple of days, means documenting the details of your method and analysis plan before analyzing for sure, or maybe even before collecting data. So why I think this is so helpful. One thing that it really did for me that I'm very grateful for is it prevents my group from rushing into data collection. There are lots of pressures, at least in cognitive psychology, which is my main area of research. There are lots of pressures to collect data at certain points, of the year. For instance, we can usually at universities get free research participants where I currently work October to December and February and March. And there's usually quite a lot of people looking for hours at that point. So it's very tempting if you think that you would like to write a paper late year to make sure that you've got things ready to go and collecting a lot of data in October and December and February. However, when you would do that, work on getting these data, getting these experiments out and ready for a particular time point, that means you might make some shortcuts. You might not thoroughly write out an entire method section before going. You might just try to get this thing programmed as fast as possible and get into the lab with it. You might try to make a series of studies predicting what's going to happen that doesn't end up working out. Writing down ahead of time and carefully thinking with your whole team about what you're doing and why better ensures that everyone collecting data understands what they're doing and most importantly can provide useful criticism ahead of time. you're more likely, if there's a better way to do what you want to do than you've realized, to find out about it if you're going through this process as a group than if you just try to rush into data collection. It's less likely that you're going to end up spending resources collecting data that you ultimately can't use because it's confounded for some reason that you didn't catch because you were in such a rush to get started with the data collection part. For your trainees, I found it's very, very nice because it makes clear how to proceed with the data analysis. If it's their job to acquire the data and then analyze it and then write something about it, oftentimes when you've got this rush to get them into the laboratory, they're clear that you've got to get into the laboratory and do this, but not that clear why or what it's for. Once you've gone through this process together, it's clear why and what it's for. So once the data come in, they're not worried about what it is they have to do with it. They understand what they have to do with it. It's written down. They've written something about what they're going to do with it. And then in the meantime, as the data are coming in, can even have done some preparation, learning something more about the analysis they're meant to do, for instance. They're much more prepared to do this, which also saves you time. What it's mainly meant to do is prevent what's called p-hacking, and that is reporting only the rare analysis chain that results in a statistically significant outcome. And that is a really useful thing. There's always multiple ways you could have analyzed the data. Thinking ahead of time about what the best way is likely to be limits that chain. Even if you ultimately decide to do something a bit different, you at least know what you intended to do all along, and very importantly, what outcomes you would associate with a success for theory A, and which outcomes you would associate with a success for theory B. So you can't just use your data in any way possible to support whichever theory you would have liked to support. Does this slow projects down? That is the main thing that we hear about why people choose not to do it. Would pre-registration slow a project down? Possibly. I mean, I wouldn't argue that it definitely won't slow it down. But it also prevents wasting time running suboptimal designs that you're then not really happy to write about later or wish you had done differently. And it jumpstarts the writing process. Remember, part of it could be that you're writing a methods section and part of an introduction ahead of time. So assuming things don't go wildly different from how you thought they would, that's all reusable text. That saves time later. All right, so to sum up, why these things? I adopted these 4 things: having an explicit lab manual, working transparently within my group on open science framework before releasing things publicly, using scripted analyses instead of point and click driven programs, and striving to pre-register everything that we do. I adopted them because they would solve specific problems. So the problems that I experienced before I adopted these things were uncertainty some months later about what had been done in the lab at the moment when I needed to be writing about it, or what had been done with the data when I needed to be analyzing it, and the person who would have known is now gone and I can't very easily get information from them. And wanting to make better use of my team's efforts, because I really did think that while they were in the lab, they'd done a tremendously good job, and they had probably done these things very well, and I just didn't know about it and didn't have it documented. I didn't adopt these things all at once. I didn't just stop working and decide, right, we're doing nothing until we have a lab manual, or nothing before we've got everything transparently online and publicly available. I had a sort of idea where I wanted to go, and then as we were working, I would pick something we could manage for this project and sort that out. And then next time, I would pick something else and sort that out. So it took maybe 4 years altogether to get these things working in a reasonably efficient way. But once you've done this, once you've done something like this, that is, analyzed your own lab's workflow and tried to figure out where you can make it better for you, I found that sharing with others became really easy. I was no longer anxious about it. I was confident about the provenance of my data, more confident than I had been before. I was confident about the reproducibility of our analyses in a way that I had not been before. And I'm still very much more pleased with the quality of the research designs that we come up with now that we're pre-registering compared to when we weren't before. So all in all, I think I definitely feel this way, and so do the people I work with, experience a lot less anxiety about sharing outwards when the time comes than we did before. Sharing with others became easy. And I found that sharing with others has been beneficial for my career. So I certainly won't make the claim that it always is or that nothing bad ever happens when you put your work online. I'm sure that we can find examples of this. But personally, I've found that it boosts the citations of our work. People seem to know about it a bit earlier, and they might cite it because of the materials in addition to because of the paper. I think it's boosted the reputation, my own personally, and also those who've been working with me on these projects. And it's generated a lot of goodwill from other people who like to see that we're confident about sharing our data and that we're happy to reproduce analyses for other people, and we're happy to give away code that we've written that other people will find useful. So what I want to tell you, and I hope that you agree at least a bit more than you might have when we started, is that transparency is for your team. It's for you and your team to work together better, for them to learn more from you, and for you to make the most of the work that they're doing with you. It is definitely for science as well. It supports these idealistic goals that we have, and I think that if we're all adopting these kinds of policies, then ultimately the work we do will be better and we'll get more truth from it than we currently do. But even though it's for science, I think that it's as much for you, probably mostly for you, than it is for anyone else. Thanks very much for your attention. You can find lots of my data and materials on my Open Science Framework page, and more of them every year.
Thank you, Candice, for this really helpful, I think, amazing talk.
Thank you
very much. Okay. Thank you, Candice, for this really helpful, I think, amazing talk. Thank you very much. Okay, we have some time left for questions. Are there questions?
Oh, I'm supposed to take, oh.
Yeah. You can take them together.
Okay, yeah.
I have a practical question. So you were talking about that you have a lab book
Yes.
to maintain, and it looks like it's open, so I could go on this lab book page. Is that true?
You could go onto this GitHub page and you could fork it if you want to.
Okay.
Yes.
So, the thing is that we are thinking about the same things, and right now we have it mostly private because there's information in there that should not be available to the public, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some things like emails or links or something
Mm-hmm.
that nobody should see technically.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, I'm sure it's the same for your lab in some ways. So do you have like a private and an open version, or how do you kind of deal with things that should not go to the public but are in the same lab book?
So I think in our lab book, we don't actually have anything that's private. We don't have any emails in there. So, and then there are various bits of our data and data analysis pipeline that do remain private. For instance, anything to do with the research fee, but that stuff's not in the handbook. So what we have is a procedure. The kind of work I do is not very sensitive, so there's very little I end up having to exclude. And so there's a very short bit of script that we modify a little bit in every study that sort of takes the raw data and strips the things from it that we wouldn't want to release, and then we save this version, and that's the version that becomes public. But anyway, those data aren't in the lab handbook. I can't think of, it seems like there was something I wanted to put in there that I realized that I couldn't, but now I can't remember what it was. But no, the handbook part of it is entirely public, and I can't think of anything that can't be in there. Yeah. And you're very welcome to reuse it. That one?
I was surprised your reasons didn't seem so selfish. I think one thing that comes up for me that I think nobody's mentioning is that I also want to have access to the scripts and the data that I collected afterwards, right? Even if I leave an institute, things like that. So I always am quite amazed by how leisurely kind of the atmosphere is compared to maybe some private industries, right, where you probably wouldn't be allowed to share anything.
Mm-hmm.
We can actually share these things and also access them later on.
Yes, and hopefully it remains that way.
Yeah, exactly. And that it really creates also a public profile, right? People see that you made a contribution to a certain code. And I was actually wondering how that is on OSF. I mean, a lot of people here might have some experience with it, but on GitHub it's very easy to see, right? Who made a contribution at a certain functional apps, but also easily visible on OSF, GitLab, things like that?
I think the thing that would be visible on OSF is who uploaded what and made what changes at various times. But since you're not really doing the work on OSF, it wouldn't necessarily be clear, like if I upload a script, that doesn't necessarily mean I wrote most of that script, for instance. You can make some assumptions about it. There's a stuff to at least designate users as bibliographic or not. So if you have users who are doing some administrative stuff there, it can be made clear that they're not co-authors. So there is that, but I think for the fine detail in scripts, GitHub would be better for documenting who did what.
Because I think this might be a really good reason also to convince people who might not even want to stay in science, right? That at least they're having kind of a public profile where you can see that that's the work that they contributed.
Mm-hmm. So even with undergraduate students that I work with, who they might be doing like one project, but they're very likely not going to be in science. I've been trying to persuade them that no employer is ever going to read your undergraduate dissertation. I'm sorry. Even if you go into science, they're probably not going to look at it. But if you have on your CV a link to this open science framework page that you made about your project, then someone might click on a link and spend a few minutes surfing around to see, oh, well, I don't know much about this, but it's organized really nicely, for instance. It's very clear what's what. Oh, you said on your CV that you can program in JavaScript, and here's a JavaScript program. That makes sense. I could see how it might boost employability and even for students who aren't going into science. Yep. I'm glad you don't see it as selfish either.
I just wanted to ask you what your opinion is about this recent Twitter war that broke out on pre-registration. So, the basic argument seems to be that it's redundant at best. So since you mentioned pre-registration, I was just curious to know what your position is.
So for those of you who aren't aware of this, if you're interested in pre-registration, it makes for some nice, interesting reading. There's recently been, for the last year or so, I think it keeps bubbling up, a lot of discussion on Twitter about whether pre-registration, and it's coming from, so don't prejudge if you're a fan of pre-registration, because the complaints are coming from people who are not trying to get out of rigor, like quite the opposite. They're coming from community of psychologists who do quantitative modeling and who for many years have been doing extremely rigorous research that doesn't lend itself very well to pre-registration, because in order to carry out some of the analyses that they would end up doing, you have to know elements of the data that are very difficult to predict in advance. And so you could end up getting yourself in quite a bind if you would try to very finely predict how the data are going to be distributed and what their limits are and things like this. You collect some data and you get this wrong, and then all of a sudden you can't do your pre-registered analysis at all, and then you kind of look like you're cheating, but not really, I think. So the debates that have been going back and forth on Twitter are from the advocates of pre-registration who say, well, I mean, you have to be able to say something in advance. Otherwise, even quantitative modeling, there's lots of decision points to be made, and you can end up just making the decisions that support the hypothesis. And people who I think have a point when they say that, well, actually, if you would try to be too stringent with it, then you would end up not being able to do good analysis. What you would end up with is people doing a bad analysis that they couldn't have seen in advance would be a bad analysis, but once the data come in, should be obvious. You can't really do that analysis. It won't make any sense. And so that's a summary of the back and forth that's been going on. It's quite heated at some points. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that if you've pre-registered an analysis that in the end isn't going to work, I don't think that should be the analysis of record. That you should be able to honestly say, this is what I thought would be a good thing to do, but it turns out that it's actually a really dumb thing to do. And so I'm not going to do that thing. And that should be something that you can logically support. And I would think that a reasonable, logical reader who has knowledge of some area shouldn't be allowed by an editor to say, nope, that's not what was pre-registered, so you can't do that. You should be able to afterwards make the argument that this is the right thing to do. But then as you're doing that, you also need to find a way to convince someone that you haven't just cherry-picked this perfect path towards the answer that you wanted to see all along. But I think that that's probably also possible to do because pre-registration isn't the only way to prevent p-hacking. So in the sort of data that I'm looking at, you can usually compute a dependent variable multiple different ways. And so one thing that you could very easily do, there's probably one way that you think makes the most sense, but your analysis should come out pretty similarly whichever way you do it. So show that it does. Show that no matter which way you do it, you get quite similar results. And that way you can, I hope, persuade people that you haven't gone down this route of p-hacking your way to success.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we will take questions maybe to the break because we need to prepare for the panel discussion, and also you will be part of the panel discussion.
Okay.
So there will be more questions. And yeah, let's thank Candice again for the amazing talk.
Thank you. Ooh, a power bank.
Here, hopefully you can use this just to power up your research.
I need a new bike cover as well.
Yeah, there you go.
Cool. Thank you.